All right, well, thank you everyone for coming to today's Lunch and Learn. My name is Todd Paropacic. I'm the Visitor Services Coordinator here at the Erie Art Museum. I also have a couple of other responsibilities. I am the musical talent buyer for the Art Museum, so I book the musicians for Art After Dark, Gallery Night, and Midday Art Break. And I also help write and edit the text panels and a lot of the quarterly articles. So for example, I've probably read every text panel in this room at least 5 or 6 times. And I do that with every exhibition that passes through here. But that still might not explain my interest in being part of this lecture today. On top of all that, I also am a huge history buff. One of the things that I do for fun is I like to read historical surveys and biographies, and I specifically have one of my favorite periods of history is turn of the 20th century Europe. So when I had the opportunity to be part of this, I jumped on it.
Thanks, Todd. My name is Alex Anthes. I am the education manager at the Erie Art Museum. My interest in this show is kind of 3-part. I was invited to be one of 3 curators in the show, which was such a gift. I also have an undergrad and graduate MFA in printmaking, so I love all things print related, its history and the processes and techniques involved. And Käthe Kollwitz is just a really remarkable person who made a lot of really remarkable prints, and I love the content of her work. So thanks for being here. The first thing we're going to talk about is who this person was and is. Käthe Kollwitz was born in 1867 and was renowned for her raw emotional mark-making and dedication to social justice, creating art that profoundly captures the impact of war, poverty, and grief, themes that continue to resonate today. Born into a progressive family influenced by her lived experience, theater, and her husband's work as a doctor serving economically disadvantaged communities, Kollwitz turned to imagery that advocated for peace, truth, and social change. Her groundbreaking print cycles, including A Weaver's Revolt and War, depict the resilience of the working class and the devastating consequences of revolution. Despite her historic achievement as the first woman elected to the Prussian Academy of Arts, Kollwitz faced significant hardships, including persecution under the Nazi regime, and the profound personal losses of her son and grandson during the World Wars. Known for her naturalistic yet expressive style, which later evolved to incorporate more abstract elements, Kollwitz's work captures moments of tenderness, mourning, and the harsh realities of social upheaval and death. Marks of Resistance, the title of the show, opens to the public technically on January 29th and invites everyone to explore the universal themes of resilience, resistance, and empathy that define her legacy and remain strikingly relevant to today.
So, this Lunch and Learn will explore themes of resistance and rebellion in relation to the Peasants' War and Weavers' Revolt prints in this exhibition, examining how these uprisings are connected to the broader tradition of Western printmaking. We'll consider how prints were used as tools for protest and communication during these pivotal moments in history. But first, we're going to fix a little bit of a historical anachronism. Käthe Kollwitz was often associated with the German Expressionists and with artists from the New Objectivity movement. However, she did not identify as either. She considered her art to be realism. So we're going to talk a little bit about both, how they intersect, and how she is neither, but kind of has elements of each. So we're going to start with German Expressionism. The German Expressionism is a very emotionally intense form of art, prioritizing the subjective feelings and the inner turmoil of the subjects. It wasn't interested in the grounded or the real. Often, German expressionist art can be emotionally loud and unsettling. In order to emphasize this emotional inner life of these subjects, expressionists would often use distorted forms or bold colors. they're known for their exaggerated and angular line work and their use of unnatural or vibrant colors to further push that otherworldliness of the inner world. German Expressionism was, in a way, it was a form of social commentary in that it was a reaction from what the modernizing society into the First World War. By the way that German Expressionism dealt with these horrors and changes was to retreat inward and to kind of examine like inside rather than point the finger at the problems that were happening. So if we're considering German Expressionism in terms of trauma responses, the Expressionists were decisively flight, not fight. And a very good example of a German Expressionist is Ernst Ludwig Kirchner.
So Kirchner was a German expressionist, painter, and printmaker known for his use of dynamic compositions, raw and emotional depictions of urban life and the human figure. This particular process is woodcut or relief, so the areas of white that you see in the actual image area have been carved away from a block, or what printmakers refer to as a matrix. And then the rest of the block that is on one plane is inked up and printed. So kind of some of the talking points that Todd made, you're seeing exaggerated figures, you're seeing kind of harsh black and white lines, it's very stylized, it's really illustrative, and those kinds of things are some key factors in that movement.
So the New Objectivity movement did not actually begin until the 1920s, which is kind of outside of the scope of this presentation, but still Käthe Kollwitz is often associated with them and isn't exactly a part of it. But the New Objectivity movement was actually a direct reaction to Expressionism. And instead of portraying the inner world of the figures in the works, they tried to focus on objective reality. Now, artists of the movement also rejected the triumphalism found in Romanticism. So if you think about the portrait of Napoleon on the rearing white horse, that is triumphalism. It may be realistic, but a lot of the features, like it was crafted to be as perfect as it possibly could be, which was a product of the Romanticism. And they wanted to, the artists of the New Objectivity movement really wanted to create art from a detached perspective. Their work was also often a biting satire of interwar the Weimar Republic, and it really kind of attacked society and tried to shed light on the inequities that were happening. And something I found really funny researching about this movement, they really wanted to show this objective reality, but artists in this movement often used elements of Dadaism, of Surrealism, and even of Expressionism to convey this unfettered, this is what is in front of us reality, which doesn't exactly make sense because those three movements are art of the inner soul. But, sometimes people think they're doing what they're not. There is one major difference between New Objectivity and those other three movements, in that the technique they used to produce their work was much more classical and meticulous. It was similar to the Romanticism with where they hid the artist's hand, but they presented the world with how they thought it needed to be seen. A good example of them is artist Otto Dix.
This print is by artist Otto Dix. The title of the print is Shock Troops Advance Under Gas from the War. He is what is categorized as a German New Objectivity artist known for his unflinching, often grotesque depictions of war, social decadence, and the harsh realities of the Weimar era Germany. This process is kind of more similar to a lot of the prints you see in this specific show. It is what is referred to as intaglio or etching. There's a few different processes happening. There's etching and aquatint, but the overarching process is etching. So what typically you have is you have a plate or a matrix, copper or zinc. The printer puts on a resist like material on the surface of the plate. Then they use a tool that has a sharp end, typically called an etching needle. They draw into that resist. Parts of the resist are lifted, and then consequently the artist is able to put it in a vat of acid, sometimes ferric acid, sometimes another type of acid, and it etches that line, and then ink can sit inside of that line, and you can reproduce an image again and again. And I'll talk more about that process later.
Okay, so now that we got the kind of contemporary movements out of the way, we can get to the series of the Weavers' Revolt and Peasants' War. So this is my favorite part because you know I love history. What we have on the screen right now is an image of the map of Germany right before World War I started. And the region that is highlighted in red is Silesia. It's now part of Poland, and it was disputed for a very long time ever since the collapse of the Polish Commonwealth, which if you know history, you know about, but if you don't, you might not. But Silesia as a region was historically known for its hand loom weaving. But when the Industrial Revolution began and Germany implemented industrialization earlier than a lot of other countries in Europe, the automatic looms were introduced to the area, and demand for hand-woven linens plummeted. Many hand weavers struggled to compete with the efficiency of factory weaving and were forced to accept ever-decreasing compensation for their work.
Sound familiar?
Wait. And then in 1815, I kind of thought about not adding this point, but I think it's important. In 1815, Prussia added a unilateral tariff of about 25% on all imported goods into the German Confederation and into Prussia. Now, fast forward 25 years, and all of Europe was hit with a potato famine. And potatoes were very important to this region. They were also very important to Ireland. But because of the tariff that was implemented in 1815, they were not able to bring in affordable food from other countries. And that kind of set the stage for this revolt. So it started when a group of weavers in the town of Peterswalde marched to the home of their contractor and demanded better payment. The contractor denied them, so they ransacked his home, and another group of those weavers went off to the factories to destroy the machinery. They attacked warehouses and the homes of those who were in power, and they even went to the homes of merchants to demand money. The revolt spread through the Silesian region, and groups of weavers would organize themselves to do the same thing, to attack the property of those who they thought were their oppressors. In many ways, it reflected a traditional peasants' uprising, which peasants' uprisings have been happening at this point for 400 or 500 years at least. I mean, in Germany, we'll get to that later, but in Germany, it's been happening for a long time. But something changed, because this was post-Napoleonic. This was post-French Revolution Europe. And the way the proletariat talked about conflict shifted a little bit. We actually have an account from a German journalist at the time, Friedrich Wolf, and in it he says, "In Silesian villages, cotton weaving was the widespread occupation. There was extreme misery among the workers. The desperate need of jobs had been taken advantage of by the contractors to reduce the price of the goods they ordered. On June 4th at 2 p.m., a large crowd of weavers emerged from their homes and marched in pairs up to the mansion of their contractors, demanding higher wages. They were treated with scorns and threats alternatively. Consequently, a group of them forced their way into the house, smashed its elegant window panes, furniture, porcelain. Another group broke into the storehouses and plundered it of cloth supplies, which they tore to shreds. The contractor fled with his family to a neighboring village, which refused to shelter such a person. He returned one day later, having requisitioned the army. In the exchange that followed, 11 weavers were shot. So, what does this have to do with Käthe Kollwitz? Short answer, she saw a play.
Sorry. Okay.
This event, the 1844 Uprising of Weavers in Silesia, inspired Gerhard Hauptmann's play, The Weavers, which was premiered in 1892 at Freiburg Theater in Berlin. The Weavers was a sympathetic fictionalized recounting of the 1844 revolt of the Silesia. And when it was released, the authorities censored the play and filed lawsuits against theaters that would try to stage it, saying that the work incited class hatred. Käthe was at the debut, and she was so moved by the play that she interrupted a print series she was already working on based off of Zola's novel, Germinal, and started March of the Weavers, which is a fictionalized depiction of a weaver's uprising in her modern time. You'll notice in the next slide that the laborers in this depiction, this is not how they would have been dressed in 1844. Germany was under a different kind of aesthetic. They still had the long, flowing, multi-layered skirts. Men were still wearing jackets. So Käthe Kollwitz's print cycle is actually a new fictionalized now telling of if weavers were to revolt now. But when she released this print cycle, it was also released to controversy and repression from the powers that were. However, she gained a lot of recognition from it. The German aristocracy considered Kollwitz's print series to be just as dangerous as the play, and in 1898, when she was to be awarded a medal at the Great Berlin Art Exhibition, Kaiser Wilhelm II refused. Now, this refusal ended up kind of adding fuel to her rockets, and her profile blew up after this. And Alex to talk about March of the Weavers.
Yeah, so I love this print. This is one of my favorite prints in the series. Just aesthetically, the composition's really lovely. The line work is excellent. The piece is called March of the Weavers, parentheses, The Weavers' Revolt, Beberzug ein Beraufstand. I took 4 years of German, I'm trying here. Okay. This was produced in 1897. It's a line etching, and she also uses sandpaper to achieve some areas of value. Kollwitz initially trained in painting, was influenced by realist Mark Liebermann's depictions of Germany's working class and the naturalist literary movement. So there were lots of people kind of talking about this, and she was a part of one of those key players. After reading Max Klinger's essay, Painting and Drawing, 1891, she was inspired to explore printmaking, wherein he makes the argument that printmaking, particularly drawing and engraving, is an art form that's to equal value as painting, capable of expressing complex narratives and emotions. He believed that printmaking's black and white medium and reliance on line and shading allowed for a heightened psychological depth, making it uniquely suited for conveying imagination, dreams, and symbolic content in ways that painting could not. After attending a private viewing of Hauptmann's play, as Todd mentioned, The Weavers, which highlights the struggles of the 19th century Silesian weavers, Kollwitz was inspired to create a series of prints that explored relatable social themes that reflected her own lived experiences and time. Consequently, these prints were created to convey the difficult conditions of the working class, and with the intention to ensure that the content was accessible That's the key word to printmaking. It's something that can be disseminated. It's something that you can make multiples of. It's very hard to control without prior knowledge of Hauptmann's play, so that her people, the people of Germany at the time, would be able to access this content and relate to it, not knowing kind of what her inspiration was. This is another print, Storming the Gate, from the Weavers' Revolt, Strom der Aufstand. It was produced in 1897. It's line etching and sandpaper. I'm going to focus more on the process and the technique because I did kind of go over more of the conceptual framework for the graphic series. So line etching. This is a traditional etching technique where Kollwitz used an etching needle to draw the composition into a metal plate coated with acid-resistant ground, which we talked about a little bit earlier. The plate was then dipped into acid, which etched those lines and creates structure for the image. That's what the drawing is, essentially, is that etched area. Sandpaper, this technique kind of creates tonal effects in a plate. You literally take a piece of sandpaper and you sand parts of the plate. You can sometimes run it through the press, and that way, that kind of contact will create areas of value and mark making.
After Käthe Kollwitz produced the Weavers' Revolt series, she actually went right into her next working class based print cycle based on an event in German history that is the Great Peasants' War of 1524, or the War of the Snails. Now, what do peasants have to do with snails and war? So I want to get a little bit of I'm going to use, I know I lambasted historical anachronism earlier, but I'm going to use it now. In 1524, there was no Germany. I don't know if you knew that, but Germany didn't exist as a state until 1877. Think about that. Wild. So, but it was, at that point, it was the Holy Roman Empire, which pretty much encompassed what modern day Germany plus Austria encompassed at that time. But I'm going to call them German princesses. I'm not going to call them Holy Roman Emperors or Holy Romans. They're German princes. These are German peasants. So it started, it was the Peasants' War of 1524 was actually inspired by Martin Luther, who in 1517, that you hopefully know, sent his 95 Theses to the Archbishop of Mainz. Now, through the end of the 1510s into the 1520s, other German German princes kind of started to turn away from the Catholic Church and to embrace this new Protestantism movement. And on one hand, yes, they were going away from an old and at the time, a corrupt system. They also, by flouting Catholicism, they also flouted the checks and balances that were on their power that were put on them by the Catholic Church. So, for example, some German princes could now start raising taxes to extreme levels because they didn't have the Catholic Church to tell them that that was inhumane. They also started borrowing with impunities, which is something that was very against Catholicism, especially at the time. And this caused their peasantry to kind of have to make up for that lack. Some princes who rejected Catholicism even tried to reinstate Roman law. Now, this was a society that was built on feudalism, which means that the landowner and the workers have a contract. The landowner makes sure that they have housing, they make sure that they're fed, and the peasants make sure that the landowner is getting the value from their land. Now, when Roman law was eliminated, it effectively brought all of the land for the German princes into their personal property. So it essentially created slaves out of the peasants. And this all came to a head, and this is why it's called, one of the names of this war is the War of the Snails. In the summer of 1524, the Countess of Lupfen ordered her 1,200 serfs who lived on her estates to stop tending their crops and collect snail shells so that she had spools to use for her thread. Now, these peasants had just suffered several years of bad harvests in the previous years, and they faced starvation if they abandoned their crops. So instead of, following what she wanted, they took up arms.
And I'm just going to touch a little bit on Käthe Kollwitz, kind of take it back to some of her prints, and specifically the series titled The Peasants' War between 1902 and 1908, inspired by the 16th century German peasant upbringing. So that's why it's kind of important to mention all of that when we're talking about her work. In that series, she powerfully depicted scenes of poverty and class struggle using only line and shadow in stark monochromatic style. As both a propagandist and educator, she collaborated with socialist organizations to critique the inequity and oppression under the German Empire, the Weimar Republic, and the Third Reich. Her black and white designs featured in posters and pamphlets revived a form of protest that dates back to the German Peasants' War, notably her iconic print cycle on the 16th century uprisings. Peasant War highlights her commitment to preserving and using this traditional medium to advance the same cause.
So, the Peasants' War, Martin Luther did not create his 95 Theses for the peasants. It was more aimed at the clergy and the leaders at the time. But the peasants were inspired by this. And so about 8 months into this uprising, on March 6th, 1525, representatives of the Upper Swabian peasantry met and laid out 12 articles and demands for the royalty. Now, this marked the West's first media revolution, because as soon as they laid these 12 articles out, in the next 2 months, it was reproduced 25,000 times, which had never happened in Europe up to this point. And not only was the speed of reproduction startling to the clergy and to the nobility, but nobody knew that that many peasants could read. And this was actually kind of the start of the working class and the peasantry being viewed as full people.
So on this slide, we've got a couple of things happening. On the left, we have an image that was produced during the original Peasants' War. It looks like it was a woodcut.
Probably a pamphlet.
Probably a pamphlet of some kind, yep. And then the one on the right is a piece called Whetting the Scythe, a print that's in our show on the back wall there. And there's a couple of really interesting things happening here. For one, the tools. Like, the tools are both kind of a common theme within both images, and there's crossover. Whetting the Scythe was created in 1905. It's a line etching, dry point, sandpaper, aquatint, soft ground. And this print, Kollwitz again showcases her exceptional draftsmanship. Dramatically rendered figure is portrayed intensely sharpening a scythe. The worker's focused gaze conveys readiness. There's an impending potential for violence, one that often accompanies uprisings. And again, the scythe is something that I find really interesting. So this is traditionally a tool used for harvesting crops. The scythe assumes a symbolic role, however, representing not only a tool for labor, but agency and empowerment. Its duality acts as both a tool for labor and an instrument of rebellion and violence, which I feel like is also kind of mirrored in the print on the left. The purpose of printmaking during the 16th century. Printed materials in the 16th century were aimed to persuade, provoke political and religious engagement, or warn against indoctrination, targeted at educated elite with decision-making power shaping public discourse.
Now, before we move on, I thought it would be important for us to know what are the 12 articles? What did the peasantry demand? So I'm just going to read through them real quick for you. So they demanded the rights for communities to elect and depose clergymen. Mind you, this is 1524, 1525. They demand utilization of the great tithe, which was a tithe based on their wheat and vine crops. They demand that that was used for public purposes after a reasonable pastor salary was paid. They also demanded for the abolition of the small tithe on all their other crops, the abolition of serfdom, the abolition of death tolls. They demanded because once again, I mentioned Roman law. One of the traditional benefits of feudalism was the peasantry was allowed to hunt on the king's or the prince's land. And they were allowed to fish in the streams. But under Roman law, all of the land personally belonged to the prince. And therefore, if you were to hunt on the prince's land, you were to be stealing from the prince. So they demanded the reinstatement of fishing and hunting rights. They demanded restoration of rights to the forest and rights to the pastures, and the restoration of other privileges withdrawn from communities and individual peasants by the enactment of Roman law. They also demanded a restriction on statute, labor, taxes, and rents, and an end to arbitrary justice and administration. Now, why didn't this result in a more free and fair Holy Roman Empire? Well, because the peasants did not have armored horses. And over the course of about 3 years, around 300,000 peasants took up arms against the Holy Roman Empire. And they were absolutely slaughtered. Around 100,000 peasants were outright killed, and even more were captured in this foray. But this war and this event would go on to inspire other popular movements pretty much through all of the rest of German history. And Alex is going to talk about printmaking.
So yeah, I'm going to back it up a little bit to talk about the printing press and why all this is so important and interesting. The printing press was one of the most important, I argue, inventions of the early modern era. Johannes Gutenberg, who was a German goldsmith and publisher from the 15th century, is famous for developing a mechanical press that could mass produce texts and images. It probably looked much like the one in the bottom right-hand corner is what a traditional press of that time looked like. However, the concept of movable type was first developed much earlier in East Asia. During the 11th century, a Chinese artisan named Bai Sheng created movable type using clay. Later, in the 13th century, Korea produced the first known metal movable type. So the West was not the first to invent printing. But that said, we're going to focus on etching and intaglio as it relates to this show. So I've used the word etching a lot, but you can also use the word intaglio. The word can be broken down into morphemes or word combinations. In is a prefix meaning into, and taglio comes from tagliare, meaning cut or carve. So that kind of gives you a basis for how this process and technique works. The structure underscores the essential action involved in the technique, cutting into a material to create a design. The evolution of the technique, how did etching come to be? How did it evolve? So there was this guy named Daniel Hopfer, he's not here, but his piece is in the upper right-hand corner. I'll explain what that is. He pioneered etching, adapting it from armor engraving techniques to a flat plate that could be reproduced. So originally, armorists had been using it, which is kind of ironic considering that the peasants lost the war because of armor. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Anyways, so it was adapted. He produced this etching, Daniel produced this etching in the upper right corner. It's called Death and the Devil Suppressing Two Women. 1515, this etching, it's interesting because obviously a lot of religious content was originally the basis for a lot of imagery. But something I feel is interesting is that there's a connection between war and etching in this context, even as it predates prints. The armored figures are literally prepared for violence, while later in the Käthe Kollwitz time, etching became a powerful tool for disseminating information representing an intellectual form of warfare. So it seems to me that there's always this history and this connection between printmaking, etching, and war, or disseminating information in a way that is truthful and dignified. So there's this other famous printmaker you might have heard of before named Albrecht Dürer. He's the guy in the middle, the beautiful curls. He was alive from 1471 to 1528, and he was a German Renaissance artist, printmaker, and theorist known for his highly detailed engravings, woodcuts, and influence on Northern European art. So he's part of, Käthe Kollwitz's history is a part of that history. He integrated Renaissance ideals from Italy to Northern European printmaking, and his work set new artistic and technical standards for the medium. There's other kind of things that print does that are interesting, like there's the innovation of color in printmaking, wherein printmakers start to use multiple wood blocks for layered colors to add depth and dimension to printed imagery. But what I'm most interested in, what kind of connects this show and grounds it in the history, is that printmaking became a powerful tool for spreading humanist ideas. And that it played a major role in the Protestant Reformation, fueling religious and political change and ultimately influencing Käthe Kollwitz. And in the bottom left-hand corner, these are just like some etching tools. And in the middle, you can see a copper plate and a plate being lifted. It's on a press. That's kind of what a copper plate looks like. And that's kind of the process of peeling the paper back after you've inked it up and you're printing it through the press. Okay, so here we are. Käthe Kollwitz passed away on April 22nd, 1945. Europe declares, or Germany surrenders May 8th, 1945. And then World War II effectively ends September 2nd, 1945. So she dies right after World War II ends. So tragic and so complicated and poetic. I decided to kind of end the presentation with these two images. And I was like yesterday years old when I learned that the Rosie Riveter image that I knew and loved, there was actually an image that predated that one, made by Norman Rockwell. And that's the one on the right. So Norman Rockwell's Rosie the Riveter was produced May 29th in 1948. Rosie is sitting there, and what you can kind of see at the bottom is Mein Kampf. She's sitting on top of this thing, and then Mein Kampf is underneath her shoe. So this was commissioned by the Saturday Evening Post, and the purpose of it was used in a nationwide public campaign for war bond sales, which I didn't know what those were, but war bond sales were a way for the government to raise money to fund military efforts during wartime, especially during World War I and World War II. Citizens were encouraged to buy bonds, essentially lending money to the government with the promise that they would be repaid with interest after the war. So this was distributed via mass printing. It was originally a painting, and then it later got turned into a 4-color halftone lithograph. You can't see it in this show, but Katie did make lithographs as well. And the impact was pretty good. I mean, it was very popular during World War II, but later this image got overshadowed by artist J. Howard Miller's We Can Do It, which was produced the same year, 1943, but in February. And that was commissioned by Westinghouse Electric Corporation. And the purpose of that image was internal moral boosting poster for female factory workers. The distribution, it displayed for only 2 weeks in the Westinghouse plants, not widely publicized at the time, and later became more popular and kind of a feminist icon in the 1980s, kind of resurfaced and revived. The printing method is the same. It's offset lithography. There's some silk screen, but again, it gets reproduced. It gets mass produced. So the reason I chose these two images and kind of decided to end on this was because of the timing, the timeline. You know, this kind of picks up nearly after, right before her death, which is very interesting. Also, but because it elevates the working class, but it even takes it up another notch because it's two women. So elevating the working class figure to a position of dignity and power, which Kollwitz frequently did, and also depicting laborers, mothers maybe, we don't know, or mothers-to-be, protesters, highlighting their resilience and their struggles as Americans, as nationalists, which I feel like she was also doing in her work. Political and social commentary, so printmaking is used to advocate for social justice, much like these two images do, and also can be used as a tool for propaganda, and encouraging women to enter the workforce for a national cause, so it has this kind of ripple effect. And then, of course, it also touches on the graphic and print tradition. Both artists understood the power of mass media to shape public perception and inspire action, or the companies that, hired the artists to do this.
Cool.
Would you like to add anything?
I think I want to make the connection very clear with the 95. It's just the same as the 95 Theses from Martin Luther being used by the nobility to remove the checks and balances that the Catholic Church put on their rule, but then the same method was used by the peasantry to tell those same German princes, no, this is not okay. So printmaking, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's not only a tool of resistance against oppression, it is a tool used by the oppressors to keep the working class or the lower classes where they think they belong.
That's a great point. So everything can be subverted, everything.
And I think this is a pretty perfect example.
Lots of subversion. So it's like we're seeing kind of some of these more painful, very emotional images, and then we're kind of seeing it subverted into being like, that's great, it's great. And it's both, right? But yeah. That's our talk.